Hello and welcome to Rules of the Game, where three lawyers demystify the rules nonprofits have to follow when they're advocating on the issues they care about. I'm Tim Mooney.
I'm Leslie Barnes.
And I'm Quinn Tu. And we're attorneys at Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy program. Every day we take calls and emails from nonprofits on how to safely and boldly take stances on women's health, climate change, civil rights, and much more.
On this show, we'll talk about some of the greatest hits, questions we get every day. We try to keep the jargon to a minimum, but if you're new to nonprofit advocacy work, check out our starter video at boulderadvocacy.org/start. On this special edition, we're sharing a recent Boulder Advocacy Facebook Live on how nonprofits can advocate in the period between when candidates are elected and when they take office.
Believe it or not, now is the time to start planning for advocacy after the election, and our podcast colleague Tim Mooney joins AFJ's Rachel Bracken to help light the way.
The three of us will return next week with a discussion on how nonprofits can hold elected officials accountable during election season.
And a big thank you to our listeners. Rules of the Game debuted as the number 3 nonprofit podcast on Apple Podcasts.
We've got more great episodes to come, so be sure to let your friends and colleagues know about the show. And now, Tim and Rachel on Transition Advocacy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Live with Boulder Advocacy on how nonprofits can assist in transition advocacy. So as everyone knows, the 2020 election is right around the corner, and your nonprofit might have mastered how to talk to candidates, but the rules change as successful candidates make the transition to elected officials. And so today we're going live to answer your questions about how nonprofits can talk to elected candidates who do not yet hold office. We'll talk about how nonprofits can take advantage of this period of time to educate a new administration and staff on the issues your organization works on, as well as what constitutes as lobbying and what does not. And so today I'm very happy to be joined by BA attorney Tim Mooney.
Hi, Rachel. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too. I know. We were just saying beforehand, we used to work right across from each other, and now is the only time that we get to see each other.
I know it's been too long, so it's good to be doing this with you.
You too. And also, if you're watching live with us on Facebook, as always, feel free to drop a question in the comments below, and we'll be sure to answer it towards the end of the discussion. And so let's dig in. And my first question that we have is, when we talk about transition advocacy, what is it? What do we mean?
So generally, it's talking to newly elected folks or their staff to help shape the future policy agenda for them in office. And sometimes you're going to see something like that through a formal entity like the presidential transition committees that are set up under federal law. But sometimes it's totally informal. So it's going to depend on the nature of the office itself. But also, the timing of things can be a little bit strange for these because some of them start well before an election. Presidential transition committees, for instance, are one of those. And some of them are conversations that you don't start at all until after the election is all over. So it really kind of depends on the nature of things, but it's all about trying to make sure that you create a situation where you're helping that newly elected official be better at their job in the issues that you care about.
So then what would you say is the difference between transition advocacy versus candidate education?
For the most part, it's timing mostly. A lot of nonprofits will begin the process during an election and talk to all of the candidates running, and that's more of a candidate education thing. But when we talk about transition advocacy, typically it's after the election, but then again, sometimes the line gets a little blurred because you're going to have transition teams that get to work well before the election process is finished. So the presidential transition teams are a great example of that. They usually talk about getting their chairs together by maybe April or May of an election year. So those committees really exist for a long time during the election. And so often nonprofits will be talking to them sort of before the election in the time that we normally talk about it as candidate election or candidate education time. So the distinction is really important here between candidate education and transition team education, because some types of nonprofits can't show any favoritism for candidates while they're candidates, and they need to be more even-handed before that election period is over. But the blurring of the lines is what can sometimes make this a little bit more complicated.
Got it. And then, as always, as we get into this, how are the rules different, or how do the rules vary for a public charity 501c3 compared to a 501c4?
Sure. Yeah, a couple of different ways. So 501c3s, and I'm going to be talking about public charities mostly here. There's actually two different types, but let's focus on public charities. They can't do anything to support or oppose candidates for office. So if you're laying the groundwork for your transition team advocacy prior to the winner being announced, you have to really tread carefully as a 501c3 and make sure that if you're giving information out, for instance, on the issues that you care about, that you're giving out that information evenly to all of the candidates at the same time. Now, if you're a 501c4 organization, you don't have to worry about that because that prohibition isn't there. You can be as partisan as you want. The one caveat that when you're doing partisan work, things that show support or opposition to candidates, that you can only do it as a secondary purpose for your organization. So that's one way, is the whole partisan, nonpartisan thing. The second way is lobbying activity. Sometimes transition team work is definitely going to be considered lobbying activity because you're asking for new laws, legislative changes, things like that. C3s, they're allowed to do it, but they're limited in how much they can do. So you got to make sure that you're tracking that, know what the definitions of lobbying are if you're a C3. 501c4s, they of course can do lobbying too, but they aren't limited at all. So that's the real distinction there. C3s have to be a little bit more careful and measure and be more circumspect about how they approach this a little bit. But once they know the rules, they can be pretty active during this time. 501c4s, well, as usual, compared to C3s, they don't have to worry about as many things.
All right. And then what can nonprofits do now, as in before the election, to prepare for the transition advocacy after the election?
About three different things that I would recommend in this stage. The first is to start building relationships with those transition team members. Sometimes that's easier said than done. Presidential transition teams, that's a pretty public thing. We generally know who's going to be involved in those types of things. If you're talking about the transition team for somebody who's running for a state legislative body, it might not be as easy. But now is the time to start thinking about building those relationships, because those folks are going to be very important during the transition team process. The second thing is to get your policy agenda set. In the fact sheet that we just put out from Boulder Advocacy, we talk about this as a policy blueprint. And having that kind of organization ahead of time is super, super important, because it allows you to prioritize how you approach the agenda when you have these conversations. And last but not least, you really want to start thinking about your strategies as well. If you're a 501c3, you might want to think about taking advantage of certain lobbying exceptions that we lay out in that fact sheet. It's called the Nonpartisan Analysis, Study, or Research. Now, that's a really long name, but it's important because it is something that allows you to get involved in legislative lobby, something that would otherwise be legislative lobbying activities, but not count against you. Super important for certain types of nonprofits in certain circumstances. But it requires you to do things in a particular way. It's got to be a published report. It's got to be a full and fair examination of the issues, and then it has to be distributed widely. All of these things take time, so it's really important for you as a C3 to get that kind of stuff set right now ahead of when these discussions happen.
Kind of just as a quick follow-up to that, say a C3 wanted to get involved and create some of those materials. Could you give an example of like what one of those materials would look like, or what it could be? Would it be like a fact sheet, a report, or even a mailer or a flyer?
Yeah, typically speaking, these are reports, but the interesting thing is the law doesn't say that it has to be written. It just has to be something that is widely disseminated. So conceivably, it could be even a podcast or a video series or a documentary. But typically speaking, these are written reports that will go through a policy analysis and say, you know what, there are a bunch of different ways that we can address things like addressing homelessness, for instance. We can spend more money on it. We can change zoning laws. We can do all sorts of different things. But then eventually this report will get to a point where it champions one particular approach over others. And by going through that analysis and then suggesting all of the different possibilities, but then picking one, this is where the lobbying exception kicks in. It allows the organization, now this is for C3s, by the way, it allows them to count this as great advocacy work. It's super, super helpful, but it doesn't count as lobbying under the law because it's specifically accepted. So really, really great exception under the law. The other cool thing is that you can share that with your allies, and that all that work, all that research, all the money that went into it, that doesn't account against their lobbying caps if they're 501c3s. So a lot of good synergies that come out of strategies like that.
We love working in coalitions.
Yes.
That we do. And so just kind of, I'm curious, what are the differences when looking, at a transition team for a governor versus a person in Congress and versus a president? Because I know you kind of mentioned this earlier, but I'd really like to dig into these different layers.
Yeah, some of these types of transition teams are going to be set by law. So for instance, the presidential transition teams, they're set by federal law. And in fact, there's federal money that goes into these transition teams following the nominating convention. So they get staffed up. They get .gov email addresses. They are part of the U.S. government, which is kind of an interesting element to all of this. Other types of transition teams, governors, state legislatures, Congress, whatever, those often don't have that kind of formal setup. And the distinction when you're talking to them will make a difference in what you have to treat the communications as. So for 501c4s, we don't have to worry about it too terribly much. But for 501c3s, if you're talking to them about certain changes in policies that will require a legislative fix, well, especially if it's a member of Congress or a member of a state legislative body, or even a chief executive, if you're talking about what their legislative agendas might be, that might be considered lobbying activity. So you'll have to be mindful about how you approach all of those conversations, because if it counts as lobbying, you got to track it, and you got to make sure you don't go over those limits.
What are some examples, say, of transition advocacy that are considered lobbying?
So I would put it in probably about 4 different categories or 4 different buckets, and there's probably some overlap here a little bit. The first thing I would say is anything that's going to be about changing spending priorities. So anything that's going to say, hey, we got to increase spending in this, or you know what, let's deprioritize, let's defund certain areas. That's going to usually be considered lobbying activity because it's legislation. Nominations of new cabinet officials or new judges. So if you're suggesting folks to fit into those particular roles, making recommendations, that might be considered lobbying activity, talking about them, because nominations are considered legislation under these rules. Making any kind of changes in laws where you would need a new one passed, so sort of amending certain existing law structures. Immigration reform to give dreamers a real safe harbor would be a great example there. And then last but not least, the 4th bucket would be anytime you've got a brand new program that would require brand new legislation. So back with the Affordable Care Act, that was obviously a brand new program. The Green New Deal, all of those types of proposals that would require legislative changes that are brand new. Any of those types of things would be considered legislative in nature. And if you're having discussions with legislators about them, expressing a view about any of those pieces of legislation, that could be considered lobbying activity, unless if it's an exception like I've been talking about.
Got it. And so I just have a couple more questions for you. And so also just as a general reminder, if you're watching live with us, please feel free to dump any questions that you have about transition advocacy or how this period of time after the election will affect your organization in the comments below. And so some organizations receive grants that restrict lobbying activity. Are they locked out of a transition team advocacy when recommending new laws?
No. And this is a really important topic to talk about because when you talk about certain organizations, we're usually talking about 501c3s that are getting grants, public charities that are getting grants from private foundations, where the private foundation says, hey, here's a grant for you. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and not let you use it for lobbying activity. We talk about that a lot in a bunch of our different publications about why that type of language isn't necessary in any kind of a grant agreement. But let's set that aside for another webinar, another Facebook Live someday. The great news is that even if you do have those types of restrictions, or if you get your restriction because you're getting a government grant, and often government grants say you can't use this money for lobbying, there are a whole host of different activities that you can do that doesn't count as lobbying. That's great advocacy. And that's not only here in the transition team area, but that's really across the board. Things that don't count as lobbying include things that don't count as legislative changes or changes to specific legislation. So if you're talking to somebody who's a chief executive, a brand new president, a brand new governor or mayor about changes in executive orders, new executive orders, getting rid of old executive orders that are maybe kind of lousy, hint, hint, for policy changes, right? Changes to how laws are enforced. We're seeing lots of calls for that kind of thing right now. Changes in how law enforcement has rules of engagement for folks. All of that kind of stuff, not legislative in nature, doesn't count as lobbying. And also, most important, another really important area is regulatory work. Again, this would probably be in conversations with chief executives because they're going to be appointing folks into those regulatory bodies and making suggestions for changes in rulemakings or new rulemakings with pre-existing laws. None of that talk will have anything to do with changes in laws, new or existing. So it's not going to be considered lobbying in nature for purposes of the limits. Quick little sidebar here. I hate to be all lawyerly here on this one, but if you are talking about regulatory work with chief executives, sometimes you're going to have to report that with state agencies, with state bodies. It just doesn't count against your overall lobbying limits. And we've got more details on that in some of our other publications. One other thing that I want to make sure that I mention again is that nonpartisan analysis, study, or research, because that can be a really helpful tool during this time. That's something I talk about in the fact sheet as well. That's a thing where you've got an idea, you've got policy ideas that you want to talk about in a full and fair way, and you put that in some kind of a publication, or like I said, you could even potentially do it as a documentary or something along those lines. As long as it's a full and fair analysis and then it's broadly disseminated, it doesn't count as lobbying activity. So getting back to to the situation where that may start all of this, if you are a 501c3 and your private foundation gave you that grant with that restrictive language, almost always the things that I've just talked about won't become a problem for you. But I always recommend that anybody who is with a public charity that does have that restrictive language in their grants, talk to their grant administrator just to make double sure that they'd be okay with this, because that's a contractual agreement that you have with the private foundation. It's separate and apart from the laws that govern all of this. So you want to make sure that they're going to be okay about it and that they're aware of it, because that's also a relationship that you'd like to keep good as well.
Completely understandable. And so, random scenario though, but if the presidential election is contested after election day for any reason, does that change how nonprofits can engage in transition teams before a winner is declared?
That's a really good question, Rachel. I think that there's been a lot of kind of deep think pieces about all of the different potential scenarios that could be happening with this fall's election. It's close. We've got COVID. We've got a whole lot of shenanigans going on with things like the post office and things like that. We have really no idea, or I shouldn't say this. Maybe we should not expect the traditional, hey, it's 11:30 p.m. and we're making a call for the winner this year. So how does that change things from the transition team, the official presidential transition team and the interactions there? Because we may not have an obvious president-elect at that point, and we would still have the current president would obviously still be president at that point as well, I think it muddies up the waters a little bit, because generally speaking, we always say, okay, well, 501c3s, once the election is held and done and we have a winner, well, you don't have to worry about supporting or opposing candidates and crossing that line because we have a winner and the election's in the rear view. Well, in this instance, the election may not fully be in the rear view on election night. It might be 24 hours later or 2 weeks later. Or if you're old enough like I am to remember the 2000 election, it took weeks. It took well into December before the Supreme Court came in and just said, clamped it all down. So I think that the answer is it's really going to depend. And I think that it's going to be incumbent on a lot of nonprofits to help educate the public about what these processes are going to look like. And then they're going to have to turn around if they're going to be engaged in this transition team advocacy to make sure that they know, well, if there's no winner declared yet, we can't show favoritism or we can't show support or opposition to the two folks who are still maybe possibly could be considered president when all is said and done. Technically speaking, the president isn't really declared until the Electoral College votes and then submits that to Congress. So We're going to learn a whole lot about the parts about presidential elections that we never really thought about too much unless you were a real constitutional scholar in college or law school. But that's going to complicate and muddy the waters a little bit. So that's a really long-winded answer, Rachel, for saying, shrug, I don't know.
I feel like just 2020, there is so much up in the air. It just makes so much sense that this too would just be a toss-up, just depending on, what we just have to sit back and see what happens.
If I were a journaling guy, I would put in 2020, I would just have the shrug emoticon and just leave it at that. That would be my entry for 2020.
Just the shrug, maybe just an ellipses, just ... to be continued. We don't know. And so, my last question that I have is, you've given me so many great answers, and honestly, you've taught me more about transition advocacy than I thought I would know before this. But how can Boulder Advocacy assist nonprofits looking to do and engage in this type of advocacy?
Most importantly, we just put out a fact sheet today, in fact, that goes through all of the details of the rules that I've talked about here and then a little bit more. We also have a really good publication that sort of talks a little bit about this from the edges, but about the rules that govern some of your election-related activity much deeper, and that's called the Rules of the Game. I would really, really encourage folks to download that. You can get that for free on our website. We do trainings on this all the time. I'm going to be doing a training this week, next week, the week after that, lots of trainings. We also have a brand new podcast called Rules of the Game that we're really excited about. And folks who are listening to the show might be hearing it right now, because we're going to take this Facebook Live and actually put it on the podcast as well. But we're going to be talking much more in depth about these types of rules on the podcast. So we invite everybody who's interested in this and who like podcasts to come join us there. And last but not least, we do technical assistance. So we're lawyers, but we can't be your lawyer if you are listening or watching to this, but we can help you with the ins and outs of the rules to help give you at least a little bit of guidance on all of those things. And you can reach us in a couple of ways, even now during COVID era. One way, of course, is through our phone hotline, and that's 866-NP-LOBBY. Or perhaps better, email us at advocacy@afj.org, and we try to get back to you within 24 to 48 hours with at least some kind of an answer to your questions. And Rachel, let me just tell you, it's been a busy couple of months, and I think it's just going to get busier and busier on those technical assistance lines. So we're really excited that we're able to help. But lots of questions these days. What can I say?
I am truly sending you and the entire BA team, as well as all the nonprofits working up for this election, my best thoughts and positive vibes to make it through until the 3rd of November.
Thank you.
And so,
and maybe a little bit after that too, because who knows?
A great point. Everything is up in the air. So our first audience question is that my C3 works with senators who are currently running for re-election. What do we need to keep in mind as we talk to them? And then are there any rules about how we work with their offices any differently because it's an election year?
Yeah, I think that broadly speaking, we want to approach this in a couple of different ways. The candidate education set of rules, which I sort of alluded to a little bit earlier, and that's essentially you can't do anything that shows support or opposition to any candidate. That's sort of the broad-based rule for elections for 501c3s. So any kind of communication that you have with those senators, you've got to make sure that if you're, say, providing information to them, you're trying to educate them on your issues. Well, if they've got opposition, they're running against somebody, then you've got to make sure that you are offering at least that kind of same opportunity to their opponents as well. So that's the first thing that I would say. Don't create new information for those folks. Information they could get or pay for by themselves. Classic example. Let's say that you do a poll, and it's a private poll. It's just something that you have. If you gave that to a senator, well, that would be a problem if you're a C3 for two reasons. One, you violated federal tax law potentially because you've given something of value to them that you didn't give out to the general public. And two, because it was something of value, you might be breaking federal or state election laws depending on their state or a federal senator. So you got to be really careful about those types of things anytime you're treading in things of value. But if you're doing things, you're only providing public information to that senator and to the opposing candidate. If you're doing things with them that you would do for anybody who would come to you from the general public asking for information. That's the kind of stuff that's broadly okay. That fits more into what we were talking about with candidate education. But like I said, sometimes candidate education and transition team advocacy, it blurs a little bit. So it's important to understand those rules as well.
Got it. And then our second audience question is, can my organization start reaching out to transition team members right now during the campaign?
Yeah, the answer is yes, you can. You're going to have to be mindful about how you approach those things. So I'm going to assume that you're a 501c3 organization, because if you're treading carefully in this area, I'm going to assume you're a C3. If you're a 501c4, you don't have to worry about it as much, or a C5 or any non-501c3, because the rules that prohibit you from doing things to support or oppose candidates, that only applies to 501c3 organizations. So let's say that you want to start reaching out to transition teams now, here in August. That's fine. But again, remember, how you approach it matters. Does it look or feel like that your contacts are the communications that you're having with these transition team members? Do they look like you're showing support or opposition to that particular candidate or to the other folks that are running? A lot of times, kind of a best practices thing during this phase, if there are formal transition team members, is to reach out to both sides and make sure that you're offering the same opportunity to both sides that are involved. Because during the election season, it's possible that if you're offering just information to one particular side, it could look like you're showing support for them and or opposition to the other side. So that would be the big thing. This is what we call the facts and circumstances analysis that is applied to all of this, which is just basically a legal term for we look at everything. And the IRS is going to look at all of the things that you communicate, all of the things that the candidates are saying, all of the things regarding the timing, what kind of a track record you have in terms of your advocacy. Everything gets thrown into a big paper bag. They shake it up, they take a look at it, and then they decide whether or not you've crossed the line. So you've got to be really mindful about how all of these things sort of interplay together when you're doing any kind of interactions with folks who happen to be running for office. So here with the transition team situation, like the question asker was asking, that's a piece of analysis you've got to be on top of the whole time.
Got it. And so our third audience question is, my organization will be talking to people who have just won the city council election, but haven't taken office yet. We want to talk to them about the ordinances and city budgets that they will be voting on after they're sworn in. Is this lobbying?
Rachel, this is a question that a bunch of us in the BA program, a bunch of the lawyers got together and asked this very question the other day. And everybody was like, oh, don't worry, Tim's going to answer this on the thing. And I was just like, oh, great. Thanks for throwing me in front of the train on this one. The reason why I say that, this is a weird area here, because what do we have? We've got folks who've won. We're in the transition period time. Election is over. We've got winners. We know who they are, but they aren't seated yet. So there's some, we're kind of in a bit of a legal gray area. But where I think that I land on, and I think that we had consensus on with the other attorneys in the program, was, look, we're not 100% sure if they would necessarily count as legislators for purposes of lobbying at this point. But if you're a 501c3 and you're nowhere near your lobbying limits for this particular tax year that you're in, because it's a bit of a gray area and we're not 100% sure, the IRS hasn't given us any real guidance in this area, and you're talking about legislation, new ordinances, things like that, it sort of looks and feels an awful lot like lobbying activity. So even though you could, a good qualified lawyer such as myself could make an argument that says, oh no, these are not legislators yet, you know what? Just count it as lobbying. If you're not worried about your overall cap space, if you're way below it, may as well count it and report it, and then you don't have to worry about it. Otherwise, it could become problematic down the line just because we don't know for sure. But as with all things, where if you've got plenty of capacity to do lobbying as a C3 and it's a gray area, we usually say there's never a problem with over-reporting, but there is a problem with under-reporting. So go ahead and count it and just kind of sleep better at night, shall we say. It's just a lot easier from that perspective.
Completely understandable. Sorry we had to end it on such a doozy of a question.
It's all good. That's why we're here.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Tim, and our podcast extraordinaire on our BA team. I really appreciated getting to see you again and also talking about such a crucial thing for this year. But thank you so much. Can you just go over those VA resources one more time before we sign off?
Absolutely. And I really encourage folks to take advantage of these resources. They're most of them are free, and we really, they're out there for a reason. They're out there for your consumption. First off is the fact sheet that we have on transition team advocacy. If you've got any questions on this, this fact sheet probably will answer those questions. Publications like Rules of the Game, which is our broad-based election-related activities publication. You can download that for free as well. Brand new podcast, Rules of the Game, coincidentally the same title, I know, but that is available right now on Apple Podcasts and all of your favorite podcast apps. Of course, you can call us for technical advice, technical assistance on either our phone hotline at 866-NP-LOBBY and leave us a message and we'll get back to you. Or you can send us an email at advocacy@afj.org. And of course, if you are a nonprofit and you have staff, if you've got a coalition or you're interested in having one of us give a training, give us a holler. We are, that's the other big thing that we are doing this time of year. It's not just me, it's my colleagues as well. And we're really happy to help demystify these rules for you all.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you, Rachel. It was a real treat to see you again.
You too.
We hope this episode helps make you a bolder advocate. Join us next time for more ways to maximize your advocacy and make positive change in your community.
We're much more than this podcast. If you've got questions, you can call Boulder Advocacy at 866-NP-LOBBY or email us at advocacy@afj.org. You might even get one of us. If you found the show helpful, please rate us on whatever app you're listening so others can find us.
For more resources mentioned on this show, plus the show notes for this podcast, visit boulderadvocacy.org. On behalf of Leslie and Tim, this is Quinn. Thanks for joining.